Well, good morning. This is Barry Jones of Standards Plus History Academy. It is Friday morning, and we are going to be looking at Nixon's deepest secret today. We've been working our way through Watergate, and I spent the last couple days giving you, well, I go back. I first went through and gave you a teaser on Watergate and why there's more there meets the eye and how it connects back. How it I I wanted to let you know that I was going to be trying to establish a connection between the Watergate scandal and the JFK assassination. And then we spent the first 2 days just going through the public narrative of Watergate, what's widely known. And then the last 2 days, given the backstory, the relationship, actually yesterday, I guess it was just yesterday, the backstory in the relationship between Richard Nixon and O'Brien, Larry O'Brien, who is the DNC chair where the Watergate burglars were found in his office, and why Nixon might be afraid of O'Brien, what he knows. And of course, it all goes back to the relationship Nixon had with Howard Hughes. Well, today we're going to begin looking into Nixon's deepest secret, which again involves Howard Hughes, which of course, if it's going to involve Howard Hughes, it's going to involve Robert Mayhew again. And this secret is considerably more sinister. I'd say yesterday's secret is pretty commonplace with a lot of politicians. They're all into the financial uh, benefits that being a politician can bring them. I would hazard a guess that if we knew uh, the deepest secrets of most of our politicians, we'd find that they were probably corrupted, most of them. Kind of sad to say that, but I kind of feel that that's probably true. They're mostly corrupt. And I don't know, maybe I would be too if I was in their shoes. I don't know. The opportunity to get all that money would be awful tempting, I guess. But anyway, let's look at that. The Nixon's deepest secret today. Begin looking at it. Got a few pictures here. Famous picture of Castro posing with a newspaper headline about the plots, the number of plots out there to kill Castro, and how the police are always on alert. We've talked about Fabian Escalante and how he was in charge of keeping Castro alive. Must have been the busiest man on the planet. Just our government alone, CIA and mafia. You say, well, what's mafia got to do with the government? Well, they were working with the CIA, so however you want to characterize it. According to Fabian Escalante's best guess, we tried to kill him 643 some odd times. That's just us. So, Castro kind of became a mythological figure with his, like a Rasputin. You just couldn't kill him. But that's not for lack of trying. This picture on the right, on the far left there, the man leaning into the conversation, that's Robert Mayhew. We talked a lot about Robert Mayhew yesterday. That's Howard Hughes's man. Okay. And that's a pretty famous meeting there. Pictured in the middle is Johnny Rosselli. He is the liaison between the mob and the CIA. And on the right is Mr. Ed. They call him Mr. Ed. His name was Sheffield Edwards. And he is the CIA chief of security back when Nixon was vice president. This is a meeting down at the Fontainebleau Hotel. We're going to talk a lot about that today. And it's a meeting with Sam Giancana and Santos Trafficante, and it's a meeting about putting together an assassination team to kill Castro. And so if Mayhew is there, he's there on behalf of Howard Hughes. So Hughes is involved in this. You can understand why Johnny Rosselli would be there. If Sheffield Edwards is there, the CIA is there. And since we know the CIA and the mob were connected, working to kill Castro, that makes sense. Why is Hughes there? Or why does Hughes have his man there? We know this story because of Daniel Sheehan. Daniel Sheehan is pictured bottom left. He was in it. He's still alive. He's all over YouTube. This guy is become a very prominent civil rights attorney. And so we'll talk about him and how he knows all the inner workings of this. And then the famous 18 and a half minutes. The story I'm going to begin telling you today is what Nixon was telling his aides in that famous 18 and a half minute gap in the tape. And it's so explosive, they had to dub over it. So, and of course, where I want to begin really is with Nixon's own words. If you remember, we talked a couple of episodes ago, the Senate committee that was looking into Watergate, Sam Ervin, they're just mystified by some of the things Nixon was discussing with his aides. He was talking about this check. He was really worried about this check to this bank down in Mexico City. And he was trying to get the FBI to back off. You know, Mark Felt wanted to go down and investigate the source of that check, the history of that bank account, that bank. He was very concerned about that. He was concerned about E. Howard Hunt and where that might lead. He said that's the lever, that's the key. He didn't want, remember, he's telling the CIA, tell the FBI, back off. We don't need investigation into E. Howard Hunt. He was concerned that this was going to lead back. If they investigated Watergate, it would lead back to the quote, Bay of Pigs. And so Irvin, he's like, what does all this mean? And so hopefully as we go through this, it's going to help explain Nixon's words. That's my hope. All right, let's talk about Daniel Sheehan first. This is a picture of him. I don't know how recent. He worked for F. Lee Bailey, and I'm sure most people are watching this, listening to this, have heard of F. Lee Bailey. If not, F. Lee Bailey became one of the preeminent defense attorneys in our country. I remember during the O.J. Simpson trial, he represented O.J. Simpson. But in 1973, he was representing one of the Watergate burglars. And what Daniel Sheehan come to learn was that his boss was on retainer with the CIA, and he was one of five. They had five lawyers spread through DC on a Rolodex that they would call automatically if any of their agents or assets or anyone connected with the CIA in any way got in trouble domestically. One of these five attorneys would spring to life and show up to represent them. Well, that means that F. Lee Bailey, who's being paid by the CIA, that's his real client. His job is to protect the agency in the process of representing this person. So James McCord was CIA. He got arrested that night at Watergate. So as one of these attorneys on call, on retainer at the CIA, it just fell to him and his agents or his law firm to represent James McCord. Now, if you remember, James McCord grew to distrust his lawyer, which is why he wrote that letter to the judge. He told the judge, I don't think my attorney is representing me so much as he's representing something else. Anyway, he said, I kind of have to take matters in my own hands. So he wrote that letter to the judge. And that's how we started to unwind the ball of yarn that was Watergate. James McCord kind of got that started. Well, he was right. Turns out, he was being represented by a law firm that was more interested in representing or defending the CIA than it was, and than it was defending James McCord. So that's how we're going to learn about this, because Daniel Sheehan works for the F. Lee Bailey law firm. And as such, he was assigned by F. Lee Bailey to participate in the case with James McCord. So he's in the room when all this is happening and all these the story that we're going to talk about is being told, he's in the room. He's a witness. This isn't secondhand, third hand. This is firsthand. And, to this day, he teaches classes and gives presentations, and I mean, he really gets in depth because he lived it. This is personal to him. I don't necessarily agree with all his politics, but I'll tell you what, he's led a very interesting life. And as a activist, as a attorney, a high powered attorney, he's represented some pretty interesting clients. He's been privy to a lot of the inner workings of our government. In other words, he knows a lot. He knows a lot. You just listen to him for 5 minutes. It's like, wow, it just spills out of him. Where this story comes from is from F. Lee Bailey's other client. His name is Santos Trafficante, the head of the mafia crime boss down in Florida, Tampa. And where Santos Trafficante comes into this is because 4 of the 5 burglars were Cubans that came from Florida, from Miami. F. Lee Bailey had assigned Daniel Sheehan to find out from Santos Trafficante, because if a Cuban came from Florida, 99% chance he worked for Santos Trafficante. He was one of Santos Trafficante's guys. And these guys were, they told the judge they were CIA, but that was after they told the judge they were Cuban freedom fighters. Well, no one was more interested, more invested in freeing Cuba from Fidel Castro than Santos Trafficante, the guy that Fidel kicked out, essentially had him arrested, was going to execute him, but Jack Ruby went down there with Lee Harvey Oswald, flew him out of there, negotiated with Castro and flew him out of there. Santos Trafficante, it's his men mainly that the CIA is using and training to eventually land at the Bay of Pigs and do Operation Mongoose and Operation 40. It's all his guys. So if there's Cubans arrested at the Watergate, they come from Florida, F. Lee Bailey is making the assumption that they're Santos's men. And so he wants to know, in the course of representing James McCord, he wants to know from Santos what he needs to know about these Cubans and why they're there and what their level of involvement is, and if there's anything there that he can use to help represent and defend James McCord. So Santos Trafficante tells him this story. And throughout the entire telling of the story, Daniel Sheehan is in the room. And he's got a website. He teaches, as I said, he really goes in depth historically. As a history teacher, this guy's a gold mine, learning behind the scenes. You teach history to juniors in high school, and you basically teach it. It's like a survey course. It's very surfacey and a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of details that are just connected by dates and people, but there's no theme that runs through it in your history text. But boy, when you listen to somebody like Daniel Sheehan, you get the theme, you get the underlying causes, you get the cause and effects, you get the backstory. He's written some books. He's teaches an entire course on the JFK assassination and Watergate, another separate course, and puts them together. And then he goes even back into the era after the Civil War. His expertise is from the Civil War on. So this guy's a veritable encyclopedia of historic knowledge. So I just wanted to throw his name out there so that if anybody wants to investigate further, there's no way I can be as in depth in this episode today as he is. So let's get into it. Remember, Santos is telling this story to F. Lee Bailey and to Daniel Sheehan, and he's going to start at the beginning. Santos had a pretty good understanding of U.S. history too. Starts in 1947, the National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Council. This is a law that was signed by President Truman. That is the public part of the bill, but there was a classified part of the bill that nobody knew about. And it created a subcommittee called the 5412 Committee, which gave the CIA, the newly formed CIA, the authorization to engage in covert ops around the world. And basically, the mandate was to promote and foster the national security interests of the United States. In that context, in those days, in that era, it was essentially to fight back against the spread of communism. So it's kind of interpreted as an anti-communist covert of the body, or a covert capability. According to the law, the person in charge, or the chairperson who chaired the 5412 committee, was the current vice president. Well, in 52, from 52 to 60, that was Vice President Nixon. And you didn't see a whole lot of covert activity in the CIA from 47 to 52, but all of a sudden in 52, there was this huge uptick, and our CIA was all over the world operating in these covert ways. And that means Nixon was all over the world because he's the one in charge of all this. He's overseeing this. It makes him sort of like the secret Svengali of the whole world. And as long as he can cloak it or argue and make the argument that this is to stop the spread of communism, he has unlimited money, unlimited power to launch these CIA covert ops all over the world. And we find out in the church hearings in the mid-70s just what that meant. It meant assassinations, coup d'etats, rigging of elections, propaganda, psych warfare. I mean, it was a lot of stuff. In fact, so much stuff that Truman later disavowed the law he signed himself. He says, the CIA's gone rogue. I thought what I was signing was an intelligence gathering organization into existence. I didn't realize they were making policy and overthrowing governments and assassinating foreign heads of state and doing all this stuff. And this article he wrote a month after the assassination of JFK, which leads one to wonder if he hasn't made the connection himself between all these covert ops overseas and what happened in Dallas. Anyway, Allen Dulles was so concerned about this, he made a trip out to Missouri to meet with Truman to get him to disavow his own article, to retract it. And Truman wouldn't retract it. So, of course, we don't know about this. This is all classified. We don't learn about what the CIA's been up to until the mid-70s as a result of the church hearings. And what we find out is the following. We find out that in 1953, remember now, Nixon was vice president starting in 1952. So in 1953, we launched an overthrow operation in Iran called Operation Ajax. We overthrew the democratically elected government there because he was making it difficult for U.S. companies to get access to Iranian oil. And in his place, we installed the Shah. And the Shah promptly gave U.S. companies 40% control of all Iranian oil. Went to companies like Gulf Oil, Texaco, Mobil, Standard Oil. These are American companies. So, and then in 1954, we did the same thing in Guatemala, Operation PB Success. We overthrew another democratically elected government and installed a U.S. puppet, Armas, who promptly allowed the United Fruit Company to maintain its 70% land ownership. The previous leader was trying to nationalize the land and reform the land policy in Guatemala to redistribute land to Guatemalans. And United Fruit, who had fruit plantations in Guatemala, didn't like that, so the CIA went in and acted on its behalf. In 1956, it was the Dominican Republic. And we, again, installed a brutal dictator, Trujillo, who promptly diverted all Dominican Republic public funds into U.S. banks. You see a pattern here. It's all about money and control of these Latin American countries. And so We overthrow the leaders that their people elect, and we put in our guys so that we can go in and rape their land, basically. Going forward, even after Nixon lost the election in 60, the CIA by that time was on a roll, right? In 61, the Congo, we overthrew their government and installed Mobutu. And in that whole process, helped assassinate Patrice Lumumba. And Mobutu, his opponent, whom we installed, gave U.S. the control of the minerals that we wanted in the Katanga province: copper, cobalt, uranium, gold. Again, the reason we didn't like Patrice Lumumba is because he wanted to save the Congolese mineral deposits for the Congolese people. Imagine that. What a concept. It kind of reminds me of what Castro used to say about Cuba. Cuba is for Cubans, when he kicked the Americans out. We spent years trying to assassinate him as well. And then we have what's been going on in the Golden Triangle. Now, what happens in the Golden Triangle starts during Nixon's time in 54, in North Vietnam in 55, in Laos. And then during that whole time, while Batista was in control in Cuba, which was in the 50s, we were operating in there as well. And what we're operating is a heroin trafficking operation. The CIA is involved in growing the heroin in Southeast Asia, North Vietnam, Laos, places like that, through Operation Phoenix, Operation Hotfoot, and then bringing the heroin to Cuba, where it's processed under the watchful eye of Batista, our puppet down there. And as long as Batista's in charge, this Golden Triangle is making all kinds of money for the CIA. This secret slush fund, this dark money, black money. Third leg of the triangle was when the heroin would be imported into U.S. cities and sold to black populations in an effort to A, make money, and B, hurt certain demographic in our American population, as you can imagine. It was a very ugly chapter. And then, of course, everything got complicated in Cuba in 60, when 59 and 60, when Castro overthrew Batista, our guy, and kicked all the Americans out. He kicked out all the big companies like Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, GE, all these big companies that owned all the sugar plantations and the mineral deposits and the mining companies and public transportation, on and on. He also kicked out the mafiosos who owned all the big hotels and the casinos and prostitution houses, brothel houses, and all that. And as a result of that, our government spent the next few years, CIA, trying to overthrow and or kill Castro, because we lost our golden goose in Cuba. The mafia is losing, according to their best estimates, $100 million a year, not being able to operate down there. Hard telling how much our big companies, American companies, are losing, not having their access to the sugar plantations and the mines and the minerals and the public transportation and on and on and on. But also our government, because Castro is romancing the Soviets. And there's a fear that the Soviets are going to create a communist proxy 90 miles off our coast. So for a whole bunch of reasons, all of these Cubans who flee to Florida, including Santos Trafficante, become perfect vehicles by which our government can try to, through training and arming, overthrow the Cuban government, Castro, maybe kill him as well, and reinstate a U.S. puppet so we can jumpstart this Golden Triangle again, and also kick the communists out. Of course, that becomes cover, right? It's all about kicking out the communist government in Cuba. It's really about the Golden Triangle and all the money that the CIA lost when Cuba and Castro nationalized everything and said Cuba's for Cubans. and kicked America out. So this is all the stuff that we learned in the 70s, and it's horrifying. And by the way, this isn't stuff that, a witness here or a whistleblower there comes forward and says. These are the CIA's own documents. I think I've mentioned this before. James Schlesinger, who was the head of the CIA in those days, actually turned over the family jewels, which is all these documents, in his effort to cooperate with the committee, made himself an enemy of all the covert operators in the CIA, and his tenure at the CIA didn't last very long. But thankfully, during the time he was in charge, he turned over these documents, and this is how we learn all this. Here's the story I just told you. Castro overthrowing Batista in 59, all the mafia figures having to flee, including Trafficante. Nixon meets with Castro and basically lays down an ultimatum saying, we'll recognize you and your government if you promise never to have any diplomatic relations with the Soviets or the Chinese. Castro, of course, refuses that, says, hey, you're not in charge of my country, I am. And so he becomes public enemy number one at that point. And 1959, Nixon is still vice president. The election does not happen for another year. So everything relating to the Cuban policy that JFK inherits in 61 is at the hands of this guy, Richard Nixon. Shortly after, 8 days after Castro overthrows Batista, Nixon announces his candidacy for president here in America. And 3 months later, it initiates Operation 40 against the Cuban government as his statutory authority to do as chairman of the 5412 committee. So, Nixon's a busy guy at this point. This is a pretty famous photograph here of the original Operation 40. This is at a dinner, some kind of banquet. And these are the first recruits. Now, these are all Cubans, and they have been recruited out of Florida, Miami area. They're Traficante's guys, and they are being recruited because they're obviously very motivated, and they were participants in the Civil War. Was going on for years in Cuba before Castro was victorious and overthrew Batista. So they have experience fighting. They're motivated, and they want to return home. They desperately hate Castro. So all we got to do is train them and arm them. And so we recruit these guys. Of course, you can't recruit white guys to go down to Cuba and blend in. So you got to recruit Cubans, and they're Traficante's guys. So the CIA recruits these into an operation called Operation 40. They called it Operation 40, originally named after the 40 original recruits, and to draw attention to some of these guys. On the left, with glasses leaning back, is Porter Goss, and right next to him is Barry Seal, who becomes a pretty famous CIA pilot. Tom Cruise did a movie about him, about his life story. He was very active in drug smuggling and things of that nature later, on up to and include into the 90s. Interesting story about his connections to Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. You can watch the movie or read the book about it yourself. There's another guy on the right. If you see the guy that's holding his jacket up over his face, that's Tosh Plumley. Tosh Plumley is an interesting guy. He's a pilot, just like Barry Seal. He's going to be very involved in this Operation 40, and then involved in the S-Force, we're going to talk about later, transporting these people all over the place. Every time you see Tosh Plumley anywhere, Operation 40 people are there, or the S-Force is there, because he's their transportation. The guy he's got his arm around is William Seymour. William Seymour is one of the guys that is suspected to have been a Oswald doppelganger through the years. but they call him Billy Seymour. But so anyway, this is just the picture of the original Operation 40. And what this means is, since the CIA has recruited Trafficante's men, it means that the mafia is now in the employ of the CIA. And this is where you start to see the merging of the two entities. The mafia had the best, most capable people to carry out this operation. And so the CIA went into business with the mafia. And their job is to generally just harass the Castro government, make life difficult for the Cuban people, the Cuban government. And maybe folks will get frustrated enough they'll want to overthrow Castro themselves. So it's kind of nickel and dime stuff: blow up bridges, poison food supplies, burn plantations, uh, stuff of that nature, sabotage kind of stuff. What Nixon was hoping on, this started in March of 59. Okay. He was hoping, this started 3 months after he declared his intentions to run for president. So he's hoping his Operation 40 will have achieved its purpose by the time he runs for president. And then he can claim credit to the American people that he's the one that got rid of that communist threat 90 miles off our coast and win the election. It's electoral politics. But by June of 1960, a little, over 12, 14 months later, Castro is still the leader of Cuba. And Operation 40, though it has made, life hectic for Castro and his people, it hasn't achieved the overall purpose. And so Nixon's a little frustrated. So it's at this point that Nixon picks up the phone and he calls his buddy, Howard Hughes. Now, as we learned yesterday, Nixon and Howard Hughes go back to the 40s. Howard Hughes has financed most of Nixon's political career, all of it, actually. He is about ready to finance him again. And of course, by the time we get to 68, he's contributing to a secret slush fund with B.B. Rebozo for Nixon. So Nixon is on he's on this kind of a relationship basis with Howard Hughes where he can pick up the phone and call him, and Hughes will answer. And of course, Howard Hughes is like the Elon Musk of his day. He's been involved with the National Security Council because he's an inventor. He's invented a plane called Spruce Goose, which the military still uses as a transport plane to this day. He built it out of balsa wood. Nobody thought the thing would even fly. Howard Hughes not only thought it would fly, he flew it. People were afraid to fly it. He got in and flew the thing. He invented a sub chaser, which could go down and retrieve subs or sitting on the ocean floor. A lot of things that he was good at that the National Security Council could use. And so he had done business with the National Security Council. Of course, the National Security Council is, intimately involved with the executive branch, i.e., from 52 to 60, that would be Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower. So there's another connective tissue between Hughes and Nixon. He's a pilot. He owns a Hollywood production company, a movie studio, RKG movie studio. Obviously, a big business magnate in Las Vegas, owns a bunch of hotels and casinos. The guy's a billionaire. And so Nixon calls him and he says, listen, I need your help. I want to create an assassination team to take out Castro. And he tells Howard Hughes, we get this communist threat 90 miles off our coast. Of course, Howard Hughes is virulently anti-communist himself. We learned that yesterday in the HUAC hearings that Nixon was on or involved in. Nixon praised Howard Hughes because one of the guys who wouldn't talk during the hearings and give names to the HUAC committee was a director in Hollywood. And so as such, Howard Hughes was able to punish him. The Supreme Court wouldn't let HUAC put him in jail, but Howard Hughes can do anything he wants to him as far as blacklisting him or blackballing him or whatever. And Nixon praised Howard Hughes for doing that. So he's a virulent anti-communist guy as well. The timing of this is what matters most to Nixon. He says, Operation 40, I started a year and a half ago or whatever, and thought it would be done by now, but it's not. Castro's still alive. So the timing of this is crucial. I want Castro dead before November, before the Americans go to the voting booth. So Hughes obviously doesn't do his own dirty work. So he goes to his number two, whom we learned about yesterday, Robert Mayhew. And you might now start putting some pieces together about why Nixon might be concerned about this, because Mayhew knows everything that Howard Hughes is involved in. So Mayhew is assigned by Hughes to start putting this assassination team together. Mayhew knows that in Las Vegas, there is a very important guy who he needs to talk to, because this guy is the liaison between the CIA and the mob. And this is coming from Nixon, so this is government. But the best guns, the best assassins are mob. So they're going to have to, recruit mob, just like mob gunmen. They're going to have to get gunmen or soldiers from one of the crime families. And of course, if they're Cubans, which they're probably going to have to be Cubans, that means Santos Trafficante. So anyway, long story short, he goes to Johnny Rosselli. Johnny Rosselli says, "Oh, this is a good idea." He says, "But I don't make these decisions. I'm not the boss. My boss is Sam Giancana. So we need to prove this with Sam." So they go talk to Sam in Chicago, and Sam says, "Well, this is a good idea." He says, "But if you're going to do a hit in Cuba, technically that's still Santos Traficante's territory. So that's not my territory. So we have to get approval from the mafia don who's over Cuba." So that is why they're down in Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami meeting with Santos Traficante. Now, this is the second meeting. The first meeting, Edwards is not there. In the first meeting, they present this idea, this plan to Trafficante, and Trafficante says, "Well, I like the idea, certainly, but I don't see anybody at this table that represents Nixon. You're telling me this is coming from Nixon," which most people are thinking, and at this juncture of the campaign, Nixon's going to be the next president. So he's thinking, okay, the next president of the United States is asking for this, but I don't see anybody here representing him. He says, "I like all you guys. I trust all you guys, but I'm not taking your word for it that Nixon is the one calling for this. I want to hear it from his own mouth, or for somebody here, or from somebody who represents him." So they call a second meeting. And in the second meeting, Sheffield Edwards is sent down there by Nixon to satisfy Santos Trafficante that this is coming from the top. Sheffield Edwards is the chief of security for the CIA. So he is representing the CIA. And of course, over CIA and all covert operations is Richard Nixon. So it might as well be Richard Nixon sitting at the table there. So Trafficante agrees, and he smartly decides, okay, if I'm going to recruit an army, an assassination army to assassinate Castro, I'm not just going to go recruit my guys. I'm going to recruit back the same guys. They were my guys, but I loaned them to the CIA for Operation 40. I'm going to recruit 15 of them back because they now have cover. They've been paid by the CIA for the last year and a half as Operation 40 assets for the CIA, which means if this operation ever goes bad, the CIA will move heaven and earth to cover these 15 guys, because it leads back to the CIA and what they've been doing for Operation 40. Since he goes, if I recruit my guys and it goes bad, the CIA, it'll be a mafia operation gone bad, and I'll take the full hit. But if I recruit these guys back from Operation 40, the CIA will cover. That was smart. That was really smart. So here are the names. And of course, we know these names because Santos Trafficante is telling this story. He's the one that recruited these guys. And he's telling this story, remember, to F. Lee Bailey and to Daniel Sheehan. Now, they're all Cubans, as you'll notice. I've highlighted the bottom three because we're talking about this whole story in the context of the Watergate scandal. If you'll notice, the bottom three all, this is in 60 when they're being recruited, but 12 years later, they are arrested in Washington as Watergate burglars. And one of them, Bernard Barker, has a check in his pocket, which leads to a bank account in Mexico City under the name Manuel Orguerio. Uh, the bank was called Banco Internacional, and that's a complication for Nixon. He does not want that check to be investigated. He also has a room key, which leads to across the street to a Howard Johnson hotel where they arrest E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. That's going to be an issue here in a second. They've also got he's got an address book in his pocket with E. Howard Hunt's White House phone number in it, and the initials HH, which stands for Howard Hunt. You'll see why that's a complication here in a second. Eugenio Martinez was one of the burglars. Virgilia Gonzalez was one of the burglars. So what we have here is a connection immediately between this assassination team, which is set up to kill Castro in 60, and the Watergate. I told you when E. Howard Hunt came into the plumbers and began recruiting his people, the reason he's recruiting the people that he's worked with prior. And of course, you'll see here in a minute how that is possible. As I mentioned just a second ago, the S Force is completely made up of Operation 40 assets that have been working for the CIA for the last 14 months. And this gives Santos Trafficante immunity, which is one of the reasons why he's telling the story. He says, this could never come out. I know that. They know that. Everybody knows that. These are CIA guys. Yes, they're mine. I loaned them to the CIA, but for 14 months, they were completely in the employ of the CIA. So we have complete cover. Then what happens is these S-Force members, there's 15 of them, get spread out amongst 5 paramilitary bases in the southeast part of the United States, 3 at each base. Swan Island, which is off the east coast of Florida, took 3 of them. No Name Key, down right off the southernmost tip of Florida, took 3 of them. And you'll notice who is the CIA liaison, who is in charge of all the training of these 3 Cubans at No Name Key. His name is Frank Sturgis. Why that should ring a bell with you is because Frank Sturgis was one of the burglars arrested at Watergate 12 years later. The 3rd base is at the Everglades in Florida. The CIA liaison responsible to train these 3 Cubans is E. Howard Hunt, another man arrested 12 years later at Watergate. Remember, he was the lookout, and he's the organizer of these operations, and these are his people. This is why all these folks end up in the plumbers unit, because they work together. They've been working together since 1959, essentially 1959, 60. Then you got 2 bases in Louisiana, one at both on Lake Pontchartrain, one on the south end and the other on the north end, and an interesting cast of characters who were located, work and help to train these Cubans in the north, including Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, David Atlee Phillips, Clay Shaw, all of the New Orleans crew that we talked about when Lee Harvey Oswald spent that summer in New Orleans being sheep dipped as a pro-Castro, ran the Fair Play for Cuba committee, working in the Newman building for Guy Bannister, who was his handler during that summer, working with David Ferry on anti-Castro activities, i.e. this base. And then, of course, his handler for the CIA was David Atlee Phillips, who he knew as Maurice Bishop. And David Atlee Phillips, now he was technically what they call a controller, but a controller is essentially a handler. Guy Bannister was working with David Atlee Phillips to sheep dip Oswald as this pro-Castro guy down there. But anyway, this is what's going on. And so we now have this S-Force training in all these 5 bases. And in 3 of these bases, you have names popping that are are going to be very concerning, especially Everglades base, E. Howard Hunt. It'd be very concerning when Watergate happens to Richard Nixon. So the important thing to know here is the names of, I'll go back a slide here, a couple slides. These bottom three guys are S-Force members, which means they're trained assassins. And then 12 years later, they are Watergate burglars. And then these two names here, Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt, are doing the training of these assassins. And then 12 years later, Frank Sturgis is one of the burglars, and E. Howard Hunt is in charge of the operation at Watergate. And of course, these names down at the bottom are all involved in the Shaw trial, right? By Jim Garrison, brought New Orleans as conspirators in the JFK assassination. You see how intertwined all of this is? All right, so back to the S-Force. Where did they get their training? Remember, one of the concerns that Nixon had on the tapes was these very sensitive covert projects further south of the border. He's saying that in the context of that check, he was worried about that check in Mexico City. Then right after that, he says there's some covert projects, very sensitive covert projects further south of the border, being further south of Mexico City, that he's very concerned about. Think about that for just a second as we describe what happens next. The S-Force in these 5 bases, every month, a private plane flown by Tosh Plumley, the pilot we learned about Operation 40, would fly a private plane, go pick up all of these assassins at their various bases, put them all together on the plane, and they would fly to Fort Oaxaca in Arizona. And there they would get off the plane, go in and sign in their names as government employees, turn around, go get back on the plane, fly across the border down to Oaxaca, Mexico. And there they would get off the plane and begin their training on a ranch owned by Clint Murchison Jr. Now, you know, as we have proceeded through this, the major players in this, for example, when we talk about Lee Harvey Oswald never made a move without creating an alibi for himself. We saw that in the summer of '63 in New Orleans. We saw it in Dallas. He always made sure there was 2 reasons. There was a cover reason for the real reason he was in any location. Well, here we have a similar situation where that plane flies to the border on the United States side of the border, stops. They make a big production about going and signing in that base, which was a military intelligence base, by the way. And then they would disappear across the border. And that was covert. But what wasn't covert was their signing in at that base. So if anybody ever tried to follow them or investigate, the trail would run dry down at that base. And as far as going across the border into Mexico, that would be the covert part that no one would know about. And they go to this ranch owned by Clint Murchison Jr., and there they begin training. And they're doing a specific kind of training. They called it the Triangular Fire Team. Now, the nickname of this assassination team was called the S-Force. It was named after Santos, who put it together. But they were training to be able to hit a moving target from distance with high-powered rifles using scopes. So they call it the Triangular Fire Team because it would be a triangulated hit using 3 teams of assassins and spotters. The theory was, this is the only way we're going to be able to assassinate Castro. We've tried to get close to him. We can't get close to him. So we're going to have to assassinate him from distance. So this is the training that they're receiving at this ranch. Now, Clint Murchison is an oil millionaire. He's basically the backer, the financial backer of LBJ's entire political career, kind of like Howard Hughes is the backer of Richard Nixon's political career. He's the founder and owner at that time of the Dallas Cowboys. He's also the owner of the Santa Anita racetrack in California, which coincidentally happens to be J. Edgar Hoover's favorite haunt when he goes on vacation. He goes out and likes to bet on those horses. As we learned, he never has to pay his debts. He only gets paid his winnings. And so this guy is connected. He's connected to J. Edgar Hoover. He's connected to the mob. He's connected to LBJ. And now he's connected to this S Force because they're using his ranch to train out of sight, out of mind, in Mexico, further south of the border, further south of Mexico City, away from prying eyes. All this training is taking place. Santos then goes on to describe how this is financed. Mob-owned casinos in Las Vegas. And of course, Howard Hughes owned a bunch of casinos in Las Vegas as well. But this is a mafia this is a mafia/CIA operation. And so Sam Giancana, who's involved, and he owns some of these hotels and casinos out in Las Vegas, as does Howard Hughes. They agree to finance this organization privately by taking a skim off the top of the profits in these casinos, specifically these two, Desert Inn and the Sands Hotel and Casino. That cash is loaded up into suitcases. Remember, we're learning this story straight from Santos. They would load the cash into suitcases, put them in fancy new Cadillacs, and drive the money to Miami. Now, they would drive through New Orleans down to Miami, at which point the cash would be deposited in Meyer Lansky's Miami National Bank. Meyer Lansky was sort of like the financier, the guy in charge of all the money. He managed all the mob money. He was Jewish. He could never be a made man as a Jew, but boy, he was smart with money when it came to money. So he became sort of the mob's banker, and he owned a bank, the Miami National Bank. And so they would deposit this money into the Miami National Bank, at which point Meyer Lansky would transfer the money as he begins the laundering process to the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, where it would then be transferred, and this should ring a bell, back to the Banco Internacional in Mexico City into an account owned by attorney Manuel Aguirre. Now, hopefully, if you've paid any sort of attention to previous episodes, these puzzle pieces are starting to come together. You remember now, Nixon was very concerned about a check in one of the Watergate burglars' pocket, a check from the Banco Internacional in Mexico City under the name signed by Manuel Aguirre. And he was on tape discussing how the CIA could convince the FBI not to go to Mexico City and investigate that check and that bank and that account, because an assassination team that was put together by Richard Nixon back in 1960 was financed through that bank, through that account, under the name of Manuel Aguirre. So any investigation of that bank and that account and Manuel Aguirre is going to lead back to an assassination team that Nixon put together in 1960. And remember now, he keeps saying this is going to lead back to, it's going to reopen the Bay of Pigs thing. It's going to reopen the Bay of Pigs thing. Those are Nixon's own words. So this assassination team in Nixon's mind has a connection to, and we learned from Bob Haldeman that whenever Nixon said Bay of Pigs, he was talking about the JFK assassination. So in Nixon's own mind, he is drawing the connection between the check in the Watergate burglar's pocket in 1972 to the same bank that paid an assassination team. And what he's afraid is it's going to lead to an examination or a connection to what happened in Dallas in 1963. Uh-oh. Now, what Nixon did when he put this team together, it was smart. He's got plausible deniability at just about every step along the way. He is technically off the books himself as the chairperson of the 5412 committee, because even the acknowledgement of a 5412 committee is not known to the American people. It can't be, it's classified. So as chairman, that's classified as well. And anything he does acting as chairman of this classified committee is off the books. You can't even ask him about it. And then he went to a private citizen, Howard Hughes, who then went to his private lawyer, Robert Mayhew, who then went to his private liaison, Johnny Rosselli, who then went to his private citizen boss, Sam Giancana, whom then they all went to Santos Trafficante. All of these are private citizens. They're mafia bosses, some of them, but they're still private citizens. None of them fall into the category of government employees. The financing for this entire organization comes from privately owned, mafia-owned casinos. It's a private source of funding. The training for this operation happens at Clint Murchison's ranch, a private citizen, not even in our country. The training of these S-Force assassins is being handled by E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, William Rip Robertson, another CIA officer. There's two of them down there in particular that are handling the training at Clint Murchison's ranch. They're undercover as covert operators as part of this 5412 committee, as is E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, as is the entire S-Force. It's like it doesn't exist. You ever see that any of those Mission Impossible movies with Tom Cruise? He'll always get this message about the mission, and they always finish with, if you get caught, the CIA will disavow any knowledge of your existence. And that's what I mean by this. These guys are so classified, these trainers, E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, these assassins, the S-Force, they are so classified. Nixon, they're so classified that they would be completely disavowed, which is why Santos picked those 15 guys. He knew the CIA would disavow him if he picked Operation 40 guys. So all of the important parts of this S-Force are covert operators or private citizens. So there's no vulnerable point here that can be exposed. And that's intentional. This is, after all, a covert operation to kill somebody, to kill a foreign head of state. Nixon came up with this idea because Operation 40 was not happening quick enough. He wants to expedite the process. And so he goes to the guy who could make things happen, Howard Hughes. And of course, he's going to owe Howard Hughes big for this. Okay, this is one of the debts that Nixon is going to have. He's going to owe Howard Hughes a huge favor because Howard Hughes has helped put all this together for him. And this is 59, 60, 61-ish. And of course, what's going to change everything going forward is everyone's operating under the assumption that Nixon's going to win this election in 60, which means the future president of the United States is going to have his own little assassination team out there working to kill Castro if it hasn't already done it. No one thinks he's going to lose. And all of this CIA activity that we talked about started under Nixon in 52 in Iran and 53 in Guatemala, going forward in the Golden Triangle, all this stuff is just going to continue for the next 8 years unabated because the guy who started it as vice president is now the president. No one's even considering the possibility that Kennedy might win. Okay, that would certainly complicate things. But as all this is being put together, pretty much everybody assumes that Nixon's going to win. And that's going to become one of the moments where things get complicated when Nixon doesn't win. And we will look at that tomorrow. This is part one of the US Force. I just wanted to give you the story of it being put together, why it was put together, who put it together, who was put together, and what the purpose of this whole organization was, and introduce you to the players. So some of the players' names that you need to remember from today and from previous episodes are obviously Richard Nixon, Howard Hughes, Robert Mayhew, E. Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis, the three other S-Force assassins who were arrested at Watergate, including Bernard Barker. You need to remember the bank, Banco Internacional in Mexico City, the bank account under the name Manuel Aguirre. You need to remember this stuff. And of course, remember Nixon's own words that any investigation of this check and this bank account could unfortunately lead back to this Bay of Pigs thing and reopen this Bay of Pigs thing, which of course in his words means the JFK assassination. And E. Howard Hunt is the key. He's the lever. You uncover that scab and there's a hell of a lot of things. This should all start to be formulating some sort of a picture in your head at this point, and why Nixon is very concerned about Mayhew and about Howard Hughes and about Larry O'Brien when you fast forward to 1972. So I hope you enjoyed today. We'll continue with our S-Force examination tomorrow. I think this is episode 52. So if you did enjoy this and you'd like to check out my website, the link is sphistory.com or barryLjones.com. Feel free to subscribe to this channel. It's free. Hit the thumbs up, hit the notification bell. I usually drop content in the mornings, but Monday through Saturday. But you never know. Every now and then I add an addendum or something extra. Enjoying your comments. It's so awesome to see in real time as we kind of go through this together. People's eyes get opened to, I see it when I teach this to my students, and they don't have the knowledge base that you have. I'm assuming most of you who are watching this, listening to this, are adults. So you have a base of knowledge that these students just don't have. But even their eyes get big and they start putting pieces together in their minds. That's cool. That's the moment every teacher lives for. So it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, you hang on to it. All right. So until tomorrow, I hope everybody has a great day. Enjoy your Friday, and we'll see you later.